To me, a hands-on instructor is straight from the real world. I picture an employee on his or her first day, and you have a manager or a boss that's trying to train them. And right off the bat, it's a very practical approach. Here's what you need to do. Maybe they demonstrate it for the new employee, and they give them just a little bit of information, the essential information they need to start with this task or this skill. And then as soon as possible, the new employee is trying it, and the manager or the boss is giving them effective feedback, like right there on the spot, so that this new employee learns how to do this skill as quickly and effectively as possible. And that's what I think of when I think of a hands-on instructor. That's their goal as well. The other thing I want to mention is that this video is the beginnings. This is where I would start. If a chair gave me a brand new course today, this video will show you the process that I would go through to physically turn my course into a hands-on kind of course. And so this is very nuts and bolts video. You know, we're moving past the big ideas and making it happen. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to take out a pencil and a piece of paper, and I'm going to start to map things out. That's how I do it. It's a visual approach, and this is what it looks like. So the first thing I'm going to do is, because I'm an expert in my field, I'm going to think of a skill or a competency that my learners need to master in order to be effective in the workforce. So I'm going to pick one skill, and I'm going to give it a name. Then, in a very quick process, I'm going to make sure that it applies to my course. It's like a 15-second check just inside my brain. I'm basically asking myself, does this skill directly apply to a major outcome, or does it hit several elements? And that's all I need to do is just answer yes or no to that, and then I can move on. And then I start moving into actions, and there's specific actions, demonstrations. I need to start thinking about how I'm going to demonstrate this skill. Maybe scenarios that I need to, tie this skill into real-world scenarios. I'm probably going to think of some theory bits that I need to supply. We're going to have to get some practice sessions going on, a very effective feedback plan, and I'm going to have to monitor my time around all these things. And so I do this using concentric circles. The last thing I do is I do some highlighting, and I'll show you what that looks like. Let's take a look at an actual, what this might actually look like with a real course. Now, I have no experience with nursing courses, but I'm gonna try and see if I can make it work. So let's say one of the skills that I want my students to master is to insert an IV line. And so right away, I'm gonna do a quick course check. I'm just gonna think in my mind, does inserting an IV line touch on a major outcome or several elements of performance? And if it does, then I just say, yep, this is a good skill, this is a good activity, I'm going to move on. So now when I get to these concentric circles, I'm going to blow this up just so you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to put the activity right in the middle. I'm going to say, I'm going to insert an IV line, that's my goal, that's what I want my students to master. And then I start to think about actions that support this activity. And so one of the very first actions that I think of is, how am I going to demonstrate this? And I want to start with the big picture. I would actually demonstrate what I want the students to be able to accomplish when they're done this learning period. When they've mastered the idea of inserting an IV line, I want to show them that. So if I can do a physical demonstration, I'll do that. Maybe show a video if I can't do a physical demonstration, just to give them sort of what the end product is going to look like. Maybe a scenario is going to work instead of a demonstration, where I'll try and tie it in with the real world, or maybe describe it as some sort of problem that we need to solve. But I'm going to start with a large picture first. I'm going to supply theory bits as I go along, and I need to plan for that. How am I going to give these people theory that's going to support the idea of inserting an IV line? And I need to be very careful about this. I'm only going to give them the essential information that they need. I'm not going to have them read an entire chapter if there's pieces in that chapter that don't touch on inserting an IV line, or I'm not going to have them read an entire article. I'm going to find the pieces that are most important and essential and give them those bits of theory to support this. And you can, obviously present theory in many different ways, put it online, have a discussion about it. Whatever works for you and your creativity is fine, but I think the most important thing is just in bits, instead of having them, bombarding them with a 60-minute lecture when we maybe don't need to do that. Just give them the essential theory that they need. I'm going to dream up some practice opportunities. Maybe at first, instead of inserting or working with a needle, I might just have them work with a pencil and get their hand positioning right with a pencil if I'm going to have them inserting an IV line. Or maybe, obviously they're going to work on on a mannequin instead of a human, or maybe they're going to insert a needle into a piece of fruit instead of somebody's arm. So I got these practice ideas that are going around in my head, and I need to start getting them down on paper. What kind of little practice sessions can I get them doing? I need to develop a very accurate feedback system, and I've talked about it in another video, but the feedback just needs to be very targeted, not general, but very specific to help them reach this goal of inserting an IV line. And the last thing I want to do is make sure I'm keeping track of time. So is this whole process so far going to take a week or a week and a half or 2 weeks? And I need to schedule in my mind where these activities fit. And sometimes that's all I need. Maybe just this is enough to master inserting an IV line, and I'll learn that as I go and have the course run through a couple of times. But it's quite possible that I need to add another layer. I need maybe another demonstration, more practice opportunities, and more feedback kind of thing, and more theory. So you get the idea. You can just add circle upon circle, and it depends on your creativity, and it depends on your class and their prior knowledge. But each layer has a very specific purpose, and that is to help the students learn the goal. And in this case, that's inserting an IV line. And so that basically is one learning period, and I may have a few of them. Insert an IV line could be the first one, and then performing CPR could be another learning period, and stitching small wounds is my next learning period, focused on the skill, and I could have several of these in my course. But what I need to do before I start my course, in the planning process, I need to pull out my course outline, and I know that my first activity, insert an IV line, it ties to my course outline, and then I just start highlighting. I can see it covers these outcomes and these elements of performance, and I start highlighting. And for the next one, performing CPR, I might change colors even because I'm a little bit crazy, and I start highlighting for that one. And then the last one, stitching small wounds, I pull out a different highlighter. And so I can see when I'm finished here what outcomes I've covered, what's left in my course that I need to address, and maybe I need another activity to do that, or maybe it's just covered in some of the the theory discussions, whatever. But I get a good handle on how much of my course is covered. So what works really well in this situation is when it comes time to assess. And so I have my learning periods, and when it comes time to assess, you can assess, in between learning periods, or maybe at the end. It's up to you. But what's really nice about it is I just focus on these activities that I have created in the first place. I am going to try to recreate these exact same skills or activities that I used during the learning period, and I'm going to assess those. And the reason why is because those activities I created were tied straight to the course outcome. And so when I assess these activities, I know I'm covering and assessing my course outcomes, which is, what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be grading for how well my students have learned my course outcomes. So that's what I focus on. I focus on those activities, and I try to assess those instead of, pieces of the activity. I try and recreate and assess exactly the same thing I was doing in class. And what this does, it makes me be very careful with my course outcomes. Let me give you an example. If inserting an IV line is my goal, and I have an outcome that says describe how to insert an IV line, or discuss hand positioning for inserting IV lines, or identify parts of the IV apparatus, if those are my outcomes on my course outline, I need to actually be assessing for those. So it looks like this is what I would have my students doing: describing, discussing, and identifying. But my classroom activity was more hands-on, and it was more like actually performing it. And so I need to go back to my course outcomes and change them. So for me, it would be something like perform an IV insertion procedure, demonstrate hand positioning for inserting an IV line, assemble the parts of the IV apparatus. So now when I actually assess this activity, I'm actually assessing the course elements of performance, or the learning outcomes. So that's the procedure that I would go through if I was given a brand new course and I wanted to revitalize it and just turn it into a hands-on course. I'd have an action-packed course. My assessments would be very authentic and very accurate, and my grades as well would accurately represent what my students have mastered of those learning outcomes. Before I started the course, I'm sure I would take this plan and check it over with a peer in the program and get them to tell me what they thought of it. I could get other people just to validate my course to make sure that it's consistent with industry and with the expectations that we have here at ACC.